Washington Journal continues.
A conversation now on government surveillance. Our guest is Jamil Jaffer, who founded the National Security Institute at George Mason University's law school. And Mr. Jaffer, explain first what Section 702 is and why Congress is talking about it right now.
Sure. Well, when we conduct foreign intelligence surveillance overseas, we often will target foreigners, spies, terrorists, and the like, people who work for Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and we'll target them by conducting surveillance on their email, their phones, and the like. The way that's oftentimes effectuated is by working with telecommunications providers, phone companies, email providers in the United States to get access. And so Section 702 allows the government to target those foreigners located overseas, spies and terrorists, to collect in the United States against them. Now, it doesn't authorize surveillance against any Americans. In fact, it prohibits surveillance of Americans. Under that authority, you have to go to a court to get a court order to surveil an American. And that's essentially how we conduct the bulk of our foreign intelligence surveillance today. Now, the reason Congress is talking about it today, it was first enacted in 2007, 2008, in that time frame. But every 5 years or so, Congress has to reauthorize it. And that's why Congress is talking about it. Come December 31st of this year, if Congress doesn't take action, that authority will go away, and the bulk of the U.S. government's capability to collect on foreign intelligence targets will disappear.
Has that ever happened in the times that this has been reauthorized? Has there been a gap in their ability to do this? And what is the intelligence community saying about if that happens?
Yeah. There was a very brief period between 2007 and 2008 when we had some predecessor legislation that expired in 2008 before this law was enacted for about 6 months. During that time period, there were orders that existed that were already out there, and we continued to be able to collect. The problem was that a lot of the providers that we worked with reduced their surveillance, reduced their cooperation with the government. And so right at a time when you might have a heightened threat, a heightened situation, that ability to collect for the government was going down dramatically. Ultimately, Congress acted to provide new authority, and that worked out. But for that 6-month period, there was a challenge where we were not getting new additional surveillance on terrorist and spy suspects.
What is the likelihood that this gets reauthorized? What are members of Congress saying about this?
Well, there's a lot of controversy about this because a lot of times Section 702 gets confused with other parts of the Foreign Intelligence Act, Surveillance Act, that allow the government to conduct surveillance against Americans, right, with a court order. And the problem is that there have been some challenges in that space in particular. And so a lot of people are saying, well, should we reauthorize Section 702? It's a different authority. It's a different situation, but it's getting conflated with one another. The other challenge is there have been some inadvertent mistakes and the like, additional queries that go beyond what is authorized within those databases. Corrective action has been taken, but because of those challenges as well, Congress wants to conduct some reforms, and there's a debate about how far to go in those reforms. And so right now it's stalled in Congress, and the problem is there's less than a month left before this thing expires. They have to take action, otherwise we'll be in a significantly challenging situation when it comes to our ability to protect the nation.
When you say sometimes those searches go too far, what do you mean? Do Americans get caught up in these searches when they go too far?
So what happens is if you're collecting on a foreigner located outside the United States, they might call an American, they might talk to an American, they might email an American. In those cases, you're going to get that surveillance, right? Now, if you want to collect on that American because you're concerned they're talking to a spy or a terrorist or the like, then you have to get a court order to surveil that American. But there is some American information in these databases. And so sometimes you'll go in and you'll search for it based on a foreign intelligence need, and you'll identify some information. Now, sometimes if you conduct searches too broadly, you simply have it on a list of databases that can be searched, and somebody hits search, and they don't know they're searching that database, you can return information you're not supposed to get. And so the problem is that we've got to have better rules in place. We have to have stronger punishments in place when those mistakes and when it's an intentional error. And so Congress wants to put some of those reforms in place. That probably makes a lot of good sense to make sure we get it right and do it the right way and protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties. But what you don't want to do is let the thing expire or put in place restrictions that would hamper the ability of the government to really conduct the kind of surveillance that protects Americans and protects us here at home.
What would hamper it? What's going too far in your mind in terms of some of these reforms?
Well, one of the biggest changes that we made in the post-9/11 era, the post-September 11th era, was to permit the government to share information between the criminal sides of the government, the FBI and the like, and the intelligence community. We tore down what's called the wall between criminal intelligence surveillance. there are some of those and some folks in Congress who think that to better protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties, we should enact a warrant requirement saying that if you want to search for an American's information in this database of foreign intelligence information, you have to get a warrant from a court, a separate court order. Of course, all this information has been lawfully collected, and so the idea that you'd have to go get a court order to search a file cabinet that has information you have already lawfully obtained, that'll just hamper the government, slow it down, make it harder, and not really protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties that much better. That's a kind of a new wall or a new barrier that could really make it harder for us to protect the nation, particularly, John, at a time when we're facing two wars, a war in the Middle East, a war in Europe, threats in the Pacific from China, and attacks on American soldiers in Iraq and Syria, and just this weekend, an attack on commercial shipping in the Red Sea by Iranian-backed Houthi rebels.
Talking about government surveillance, our guest is Jamil Jaffer this morning. He serves as the founder of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Law School. If you want to join the conversation, you can do so. Phone lines are open. Democrats, it's 202-748-8000 to call in. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Independents, 202-748-8002. In the world of government surveillance, of intelligence collecting, how much of our information comes from a Section 702 type program versus the kind of information we get from human intelligence sources, from spies overseas? Explain where this fits into the world of our intelligence that we gather.
This is probably one of the most important intelligence collections programs we have. And the reason why is because it collects information against a lot of terrorist targets and spy targets. About 100,000 to 200,000 a year are the number of people that are under coverage. You think about that, that's not really that many people. When you think about 7.5 billion people worldwide, 350 million Americans, a few hundred thousands, a small number, but those are the really high-value targets. So
and those few 100,000, we get access to all of their phone records, everyone that they've been talking to. Is it transcripts of calls? How far does this go?
Well, it can and often is the content of their communications. Remember, these are foreigners located outside the United States, and so it is the content of those communications. Now, of course, you have to translate all of that. You've got to process it. An analyst has to look at it, right, and then create intelligence reporting. But this capability is so important, it contributes about 60% of the president's daily brief, that high priority stuff, the most important stuff the president reads every day. About 70% of the articles in that book the president gets come from the information comes from the Section 702 program. So you imagine if that program went away, a huge chunk of the information the president of the United States gets every day, highest priority, could be gone.
For Section 702, what are the successes? Will the intelligence community say this program stopped this attack? Have they been doing that to try to advocate for this program?
So, one of the challenges with the intelligence community is that they won't declassify as much as you or I might like about what they're collecting. So they'll talk about it at the level of helped us disrupt an attack in a foreign country, right? Or helped us disrupt a major drug smuggling operation involving fentanyl, right? All of which Section 702 is done, right? But they won't give you the details of it was this bomb plot in this city on this date. In part because you don't want to let people onto the fact that you're on surveillance on them or their friends. Now, that being said, we can see from what the intelligence community has declassified that across the board, it's not just terrorism. It's not just terrorist attacks potentially in the U.S. and abroad. It's not just threats to American soldiers. It's fentanyl coming across the border from China into the United States. So it's a broad scope of intelligence collection that protects Americans not just from spies and terrorists, but drug smugglers, Chinese hackers, Russian hackers, and the like.
What do the telecommunications companies say about this? Do they like Section 702? How much of a hassle is it for them to turn over this information when the government asks 200,000 times a year?
Yeah. So at this point, I think the telecommunications companies, the internet service providers, the folks that the government goes to collect this information are used to getting requests for information because this has been going on now for about 15 plus years. And so they're in the mode of operationalizing it. They can handle the queries. That's not a challenge. But the real question, right, is, are we getting enough and are we going to be able to get the stuff that we have and are we able to use it, right? And so if the authority goes away, you're simply not going to get it. If the authority stays in place, but the government puts up barriers in place that make it hard to share information, this is what happened in the lead up to 9/11. If you remember, there were two al-Qaeda terrorists that flew the plane into the Pentagon. Those two individuals, Khalid Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, lived in San Diego in their true names, right? We could have found them. The CIA actually had taken pictures of them in Kuala Lumpur a year earlier at a meeting of known al-Qaeda operatives. But because there was this concern, Can we share information with the FBI? Are we able to? Are we not able to? That information wasn't effectively shared. We ultimately didn't find Hazmi and Midar. That we were starting to look for them at the last minute, and they ultimately flew planes in the Pentagon. Now, I'm not saying we could have stopped the 9/11 attacks, but you think about the reasons that we had decided to take down this wall between criminal surveillance and criminal efforts and intelligence efforts. It's precisely this reason. Rebuilding it now would be a mistake.
I don't think it gives away the playbook, but if one is a terrorist in 2023, shouldn't they just assume that if they connect to a U.S. network with their cell phone, that the U.S. government will have access to that?
Absolutely. But the beauty of Section 702 capability is that oftentimes it isn't just communications where you're using a U.S. cell phone number or a U.S. email address, right? You may be able to gather information about phone calls overseas by going to U.S. providers because of the way the telecommunications system works. And so that's one of the amazing things about Section 702 and the authorities that it gives us. It allows us to collect on a lot of information that might not be obvious that somebody might have. So I think, look, if you're a terrorist or spy, you should assume we're surveilling you, right? And you should assume we're onto you, right? Again, we only collect on a few 100,000, so we may not be. But the reality is you should probably operate that way. But the fact is people have to work, they have to communicate, they have to share information. If we can get it and use it to protect Americans here in the United States and abroad, we're safer as a result.
So your opinion is that this should be reauthorized and reauthorized as is without new restrictions?
Look, in an ideal world, that would be the case, but there have been some challenges with respect to how the FBI has utilized the information. So I think some reforms are necessary, right? You're going to need some better reporting requirements, some more oversight by Congress. I think it's helpful to have higher levels of approval at the FBI. The one thing I think that you should not do, right, in terms of reforms, and there are some reforms that would be helpful, right, would be to put this barrier up, create a new warrant requirement for information that the government has already lawfully collected. That would be like literally taking a file drawer of highly important information and saying, I'm going to lock it up until I have to go to a judge to go into that drawer to get information I already have. This is exactly the kind of barrier that we created pre-9/11. We don't want to recreate that mistake.
Let me let you chat with a few callers, and there are several for you already. Jamil Jaffer with us until the top of the hour at 10 a.m. Eastern, when we're going to end our program today. He's with George Mason University Law School's National Security Institute. C-SPAN viewers have certainly seen him on this program in the past. This is Sean in Colorado, up first in this segment. Republican, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Jamal, the crisis is the plea of tyrants. Now, our Constitution's at risk with this renewal of this bill. Americans were spied on. Tucker Carlson was spied on. Mainly right-wing people were spied on by the brown shirts at the FBI and the DOJ. They're now prosecuting a political opponent. You got to be kidding me. This bill, Speaker, needs to be killed. This administration is out of control, and it just shows how they can abuse these warrants. They need to get a warrant to go after any American. Thank you, and I hope our country survives this administration.
You know, John, Sean raises a really important point. There are a lot of concerns amongst both liberals and conservatives about government surveillance. But John raises the point about surveillance on political opponents and the like. It's a real challenge, and one we should really be worried about. The thing about Section 702 is that it doesn't authorize surveillance against any Americans. So even if Tucker Carlson was surveilled, I don't think we've seen necessarily proof that he was, but if he was, they would have had to go to a federal court and get a court order. Now, I think what Sean is talking about is the Carter Page surveillance incident. He was, if you remember, he worked for the Trump campaign. The government was surveilling him. They were under Title I of FISA. That's not Section 702. They had actually gone to a federal court and gotten a court order from a judge. Now, the problem with that court order, when they went to go renew it, was the lawyer working on that court order told an untruth. He modified a fact that he knew that actually Carter Page was working for the U.S. government to say he was not working for the U.S. government. Now, that lawyer was prosecuted. Wasn't prosecuted as tough as I would have done. I would have stripped him of all of his bar licenses and the like, and I would put him in jail. Ultimately, he pled to a deal. But that is the kind of violation, the kind of problem that the law is exactly designed to catch. It was caught. The guy didn't go to prison, but was prosecuted. And ultimately, it wasn't about this authority. It's a different authority. This authority doesn't permit the surveillance of any Americans. Now, it's also important to remember that this authority was first obtained in a Republican administration, the Bush administration. I served in that administration. This authority was reauthorized under President Obama. It was reauthorized under President Trump. Post Carter Page incident, post the discussion of that, because President Trump and his team understood Section 702 not about this particular issue. And now the Biden administration, yes, is seeking surveillance, but this isn't a political thing. This is about foreign spies and terrorists overseas. not about American political opponents at home.
Maybe a good time to explain for viewers what you did before founding the National Security Institute at George Mason, both in the White House and on Capitol Hill as well.
Sure. So I served in the Bush administration at the Justice Department in the Office of Legal Policy, as well as the National Security Division, which is in charge of prosecuting terrorists and spies and obtaining this kind of surveillance. I then worked at the White House Counsel's Office as an associate counsel to President Bush, and then took some time off and then went back to the government at the House Intelligence Committee. I worked for Republican Congressman from Michigan, Mike Rogers, and then for the Republican chairman of the Senate and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker. What is the mission of the National Security Institute? So, look, we're out there to make sure that America is protected, well protected, safe. We bring together a bipartisan group of experts from across the political aisle, talk about and debate the issues of American national security, both technology, national security, as well as all the issues that are facing our country, the wars that are going on today. And we advocate for a lean forward approach by America, for America leading in the world, right? Leading by example and by action. We believe that the world is safer when America acts and supports its allies and opposes its adversaries. And so we're that as a think tank. We're also an academic center. So we train students. We educate a group of JD students, law students at George Mason's Law School. We also have undergraduate students who get a JM, an introductory degree of the law. And then we also have graduate degrees of the law, a master's degree for cyber intelligence and national security. What's the most important thing the United States can do today in December 2023 to lean forward, to act, and to be that security in the world that you're just talking about? Well, look, I think we don't want to be the world's policeman. At the same time, the reality is that we are facing threats in various parts of the globe, and our allies are under attack. Our partners in Ukraine are being attacked by a brutal dictator in Vladimir Putin. We see the terrorist attack against Israel by Hamas and the ongoing war there now to dismantle Hamas. We see China threatening our allies, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and now just getting into fights with the Philippines over fishing rights and actually ramming ships. And just over the weekend, we saw commercial shipping attacked by Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. A U.S. destroyer went and provided aid and was potentially threatened as a result as well. And 63 attacks against American soldiers in Iraq and Syria by Iranian-backed rebels in the Middle East in the last month alone, John. So it's not just that we have to defend our allies and our friends. We are today under attack, and there are direct threats to Americans here at home and abroad. And so it's critical that we respond to those attacks, we support our allies, and we push back against those adversaries who are coming at us. The less we do that, the more likely they're going to test our boundaries and come harder at us. And quickly on the naval attack over the weekend, remind folks who the Houthis are and the significance of this attack. So the Houthi rebels are a group in Yemen. And they've been fighting with the government of Yemen for quite a while. They've gained a significant amount of ground. They now have control over significant parts of Yemen. The Saudi government has backed the Yemeni government, as has the United States. And the Iranian government has backed these Houthi rebels. They're now attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea, saying that they're helping try to defending Hamas and based on what's happening in Gaza. And so these are this is a U.S. listed terrorist group, as is Hamas, by the way. Hamas has been on the U.S. terrorist list since 1997. What does attacking commercial shipping do for Hamas? So they are trying to demonstrate that they are supporting them. And some of these ships are Israeli ships. So they're trying to demonstrate that they're going to attack Israeli civilians on these ships and the like, or they're carrying goods for Israel. The truth of the matter is that these ships that were attacked actually have relations with 14 countries. They're flagged oftentimes in Bermuda, run by UK companies. They might be carrying Israeli goods, but these are oftentimes Panamanian flag ships with American captains, right? And so that's part of the challenge. It's part of why the U.S. these are international waters. It's why the U.S. is there protecting those ships and responding to distress calls and then potentially coming under attack themselves. Is this ship-to-ship attacks? Is it short-range missiles? Do we know much about it? What we've heard is it was missiles, and the Houthis often use these drones that Iran has supplied them to conduct these attacks. We know that at least one drone and one missile was shot down by the U.S. destroyer there in the region. There have been prior missiles and drones that have been launched from Yemen by the Houthis, we believe targeting Israel, and those have also been shot down by U.S. Warships in the region. More calls for you. This is Franklin here in D.C. Independent. You're on with Jamil Jaffer.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. You know, I've always been a proponent of, I think, repealing this provision out of concerns for, domestic surveillance and some of the things that the speaker has talked about. That was up until 15 minutes ago when John let that pedophile go on his monologue, and now I'm concerned that people like him are slipping through the cracks. And I think that we need to do everything we can to kind of sweep up those kinds of callers that are so prominent on Washington Journal. So, John, I wanted to thank you for letting him bare himself and changing my mind on this important national security provision.
Domestic surveillance, the process for surveilling somebody domestically.
So if you want to get any surveillance against an American anywhere in the world, whether they're in the United States or abroad, you have to go to a court. If it's for foreign intelligence surveillance, you go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. If it's a typical criminal case, you'll go to a federal judge. The process is almost identical. You have to go in, you have to meet with the judge, you have to present them probable cause to show something. In the case of a traditional warrant, it's probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. In the case of a foreign intelligence surveillance warrant or court order, it's probable cause to believe that they're a foreign intelligence officer, an agent of a foreign power, right? So no matter what, when you're going after an American, you're focused on an American, you're targeting an American, you have to go get a court order. That's existing law. And in fact, Section 702 actually made that the law for Americans overseas. Used to be back in the day, if you want to conduct surveillance against an American overseas, you just had to get Attorney General authorization. If Section 702 goes away, that protection for Americans overseas goes back to just Attorney General authorization. So if you're worried about surveillance of Americans, you want Section 702 and its protective provisions, as well as the provisions where it allows surveillance of foreigners located overseas to be reauthorized. And again, if you're looking for reforms, there are reforms being considered. That's not off the table. But what you don't want to do is to create a warrant requirement for searching that lawfully collected database once we have it.
To James in Matthews, North Carolina, line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Jaffer. I noticed you were smiling at the guy on the right when he made a few statements about this law, and I'm on the left. And I see the problem. You guys just muscle right through the middle with your so-called think tanks. You know, you got these think tanks who just sit around and make up equations. Now, this 702 law, it doesn't do nothing. It doesn't protect the American people. I mean, right now, I don't care who you are. You got to have a warrant, and you got to have some kind of document to enter anyone's home or to listen to anyone. But the thing is, you guys give us this false sense of security. I'm a minority. Right now, I could be sitting in my house, cops could bang down the door. You know, I know this is a state matter or a city, a local matter, but they just bust in your door with or without a warrant. You know, nothing happens to them. They might get a couple of weeks of paid vacation. You guys are the problem. You know.
Well, let me give Jamil Jaffer a chance to respond.
Well, I think James raises an important point, right, which is a lot of Americans are skeptical of government activities, government surveillance and the like. And this is not surprising, right? I think we should be suspicious of government activity. We come from that tradition, right? We were born as a nation deeply suspicious of British soldiers coming into our homes, right, quartering troops in our houses, doing things that we believe were unlawful. It's exactly why we have the Constitution we have. It's exactly why we have those first 10 amendments to the Constitution that protect our rights. It's why we have the Fourth Amendment. Now, the important thing to remember, though, about Section 702 is, again, it doesn't authorize surveillance of any Americans. You're required, it only authorizes surveillance of foreigners. Remember, these people living outside the United States who have no rights under our Constitution, these are not American citizens we're talking about. These are not people in the United States. These are foreigners located overseas. They don't have any rights under the Fourth Amendment. And even then, we still provide all these protections. We have reporting back to Congress. We have oversight by a court, right? Generalized oversight, right? And so there's a lot of protections in place, even for these foreign individuals located overseas. And so for Americans, though, regardless of where you are in the world, Section 702 and the law and the statutes that we have in place require you to go to a federal judge, get that court order, get that warrant, whether you're doing it in the criminal context or the foreign intelligence context. That's the law today. So I understand the skepticism and the desire to protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties, and that is exactly what these laws are designed to do. This is a law not about Americans, but about foreigners located overseas.
What did you think about the Patriot Act?
So the Patriot Act had a lot of provisions I think were really important, right? Most of them have been made now permanent by Congress and by working with the executive branch. So a lot of those provisions were critically important to helping protect the nation. And I'll say this, right? For the last 20 years, 20 plus years now, we've been protected at home in this nation from a mass casualty terrorist attack, in part because of the changes in law that we made to protect the nation and the changes in operation, this collaboration between intelligence officials and criminal officials to better protect the nation. And frankly, going on the offensive against al-Qaeda and other terrorists overseas, keeping them on the run, that's what's kept us safe in this country for 20 plus years.
Did it go too far in any aspects?
I think there were elements of it that might have gone a little bit too far. We've walked some of those back. Congress, in reauthorizing some of these provisions, made modifications and added additional oversight and reporting. I think those were valuable things to do. And again, in this context of the reauthorization, there are reforms that are valuable. We should put those reforms in place and then move forward.
About 15 minutes left in our program today. Jamil Jaffer, our guest of the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Law School. This is Kia out of Las Vegas, Republican. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing well. Go ahead.
Good. I recall a few months ago, they were having some congressional hearings where they were talking about 702 abuses because the law was being circumvented and the courts were being circumvented, and they were using their power to spy on Americans. And I think it's too much of a government overreach, so I think that they should repeal it. Also, if Biden was stronger as a president, we would not have threats of terrorism. And if we shut our border, that should be the first line of defense for anything. Because with our border wide open, terrorists are walking right through. Just yesterday, or Friday, the court in Texas, they said to take the buoys down. So seems like that should be our first line of defense. So that's my thoughts on that. Have a good morning.
Jamil Jaffer.
Look, I think Kia is right. We need to better protect our border. We need to defend that border against people crossing it illegally. It's not well defended enough. That has to happen. Congress is working on that effort. It's critical that we do that. I don't disagree with Kia at all about that. I also agree that if we had a stronger role leaning more forward in the world and our adversaries were actually afraid of us, right, that would prevent people from conducting attacks against the United States and threatening our people, whether in the Middle East or around the globe. So I do think that Kia is right on both those fronts. All that being said, if we're going to go against our adversaries or know who's crossing the border or know what the threats to the border are and prevent fentanyl from crossing that porous southern border, we're going to do it by conducting surveillance of foreign intelligence targets like the Chinese who are helping create those fentanyl precursors and fentanyl that's crossing into the United States and those that are coming against Americans all around the world. And so it is critical that we have this capability. It's part of a larger thing that involves defending the border, involves being stronger and being more aggressive against our adversaries, is having this kind of intelligence information. Now, Kia makes the point about abuses that took place and problems. There were certain abuses that took place that were intentional. Oftentimes, there were about 3 or 4 or 5 or a handful of times, I should say, not often, there were people who went in and looked at the database for their love interest, for example. They tried to find their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their significant other. Those people were prosecuted. They're stripped of their security clearances and the like. Those abuses have been addressed, right? The other types of situations where there were over collections or searches that went too broadly, 99 to 100% of those were situations where people were making unintentional mistakes. Those were all reported to Congress, reported to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and measures were put in place to stop those things from happening. Again, there are reforms being considered. Those reforms should be put in place to prevent those things from happening again. But we're not talking about the kind of wide-scale abuse that I think a lot of people perceive might be taking place. That's not actually what's going on here in this program.
Staying on the border for just a second longer, Hammy with a question from X saying, what surveillance is used at the border with Mexico?
So we have all kinds of surveillance at the border. Obviously, we have cameras to watch as people try to come across the border. Clearly, we're not doing a good enough job of stopping people from coming in to this country through that border. But we're also going to take electronic surveillance using Section 702 and other authorities to understand what are the smugglers doing, what routes are they taking, what are their methodologies, what are the drug mules doing, right? How are they operating, and what is the Chinese government doing to get fentanyl into the United States? Now, President Biden just met with President Xi, and they agreed to stop the flow of fentanyl. I'm not sure why it takes an agreement between two leaders of countries to stop a drug that is killing hundreds of thousands of Americans a year in this country. It's unconscionable that we allow fentanyl flow across the border, and Section 702 helps stop that drug trade from coming across the border.
McLean, Virginia. This is Stacy, an independent. Good morning.
Good morning, John. Thanks for having me on. I had a couple of comments. First of all, America has funded every one of our enemies. Before they were our foes, they were our friends. I don't care if it was Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, the Taliban, you name it. We have supported and funded them, correct? As far as the border crisis is concerned, if we wanted to solve that, you prosecute every corporation that hires these illegals. You'll stop it tomorrow. if they went to jail for hiring illegals. That's nonsense. As far as the surveillance, maybe we should start surveilling our government officials because they make $174,000 a year, and they walk out of office multi-millionaires. Most of them have dual citizenships in other countries, and their loyalties are not to the United States of America. They're to the countries they are have dual citizenship to. They shouldn't even be allowed to vote on any legislation that has to do with any country they have dual citizenship in.
Is there any member of Congress that you think is doing a good job?
After what's going on in Israel, and to see the genocide that's going on, and it is a genocide. What Netanyahu is doing to the Palestinians, Hitler did to the Jews. I see no difference to what they're doing. And for them to co-sign and to pretend to be the moral compass of the world and to let this tragedy happen, and then you talk about we're going to take care of, save the world. You can't even save your own people. We got people living on the streets.
Got your point. Let me let Jamil Jaffer jump in.
Well, on Stacey's point about what's going on with Israel and Hamas, I think it's worth remembering that the terrorist attacks that happened on October 7th, right, again, conducted by Hamas, a U.S.-enlisted terrorist organization since 1997, were the equivalent on a population-adjusted basis of about a dozen 9/11 attacks. So we lost 3,000 people on a population of about 280 million back in 2001. The Israelis lost 1,500 people, 1,400 people on a population of just around 9 million. About a dozen 9/11s that day. That single attack. So it was a catastrophic attack, the single largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust in a single day. And so while we watch this war being prosecuted against Hamas, and this is not a war against the Palestinian people, this is a war against a terrorist group, right? There are civilian casualties, and they are terrible, right? But you think about civilian casualties, you think about a city of 2 million people, and you think about what the incentives are. For every Palestinian civilian, woman, child that's killed in this war, it makes it harder for Israel to prosecute this war. It is harder for Israel to go after Hamas if they kill Palestinian women and children. On the other hand, if a Palestinian woman or child dies, a civilian dies, Hamas benefits. They get additional sympathy. The world responds, as it should. And so the incentives are for the Israelis not to kill civilians and for Hamas to try and put more and more civilians in harm's way. And that's exactly what you've seen. You've seen Israel tell Palestinian civilians, go south, right? Move out of the way of the ground incursions coming in. And Hamas tells the Palestinian civilians, stay here, oftentimes forcing them to stay. And so because the incentives work that way, right, this is obviously the loss of life that's happening is tragic. And one can have sympathy for the Palestinian people and still say Hamas needs to be destroyed and taken apart and find a way to prosecute this war that follows humanitarian law, as Israel is trying to do in this case, right? In a city of 2 million, it is hard to avoid killing civilians, but the war has to be prosecuted. It's Hamas hiding inside those tunnels, hiding in hospitals, hiding in schools.
Do you think the IDF has done enough to allow the international world to see what they're trying to do in Gaza to avoid what you've just talking about? Concerns from callers about communications being shut down in Gaza, not being able to see the results of what they're doing.
I think the IDF certainly could do more if they wanted to, right? Oftentimes the U.S. military, when it goes in, will have war reporters traveling with them, right? We haven't seen enough of what they're trying to do to protect civilians. I think if they were to provide a little more insight into that, I think what you would see is an operation that is very cognizant of civilian deaths, right? Because again, the incentives for Israel are not to kill civilians. It's to avoid civilian casualties at all costs. It only makes it harder for them in the international community, support from the U.S. and the like, if civilians are dying. On the other hand, they know that Hamas benefits from civilians dying. And so, again, they don't want to give Hamas that win. And so I think if you were sitting inside of an Israeli command center and watching the decisions being made about what strikes to take, how to take those strikes, what ground incursions to make, I can bet anything like it is in an American command center, right? You are doing everything you can to minimize casualties because you know that civilian casualties, because you know it only benefits the adversary. And in this scenario, where the eyes of the world are very focused on Gaza and what's happening there, right? The Israelis are painfully aware of the things. So could the IDF let journalists provide more information on what they're doing to protect civilians? That might be a smart move.
Less than 5 minutes left with Jamil Jaffer this morning, taking your phone calls. This is Mark, Cloverdale, Indiana, Independent. Good morning.
Good morning. I appreciate the stand that your present guest is taking on the war against Hamas. I do want to make one comment. Basically, the Authorization Act was used to spy on President Trump and also to attack his administration and cause so much trouble in our government for the first 4 years. And I'm wondering if this thing is still in effect, whether it can be used to check out Biden and all his shenanigans and to check all his connections with China and all the friendships his son has made with all of these people who are giving him money. And of course, he's probably getting a lot filtered. We even have checks on that he has received from his son and brother.
Got your questions. Running short on time. Jamil Jaffer.
So, again, as we talked about earlier, this law cannot be used to surveil Americans anywhere, period, full stop. So if there was surveillance of President Trump in his campaign, and we know about Carter Page, that was conducted under other authorities, whether a criminal warrant. In that case, it was a foreign intelligence surveillance warrant, but not this law, to be clear. Not Section 702, only permits surveillance of foreigners located outside the United States. So that, for Mark, should not be a concern because it's not what this law is about. Now, to the question of what we should do to better protect Americans' privacy and civil liberties, that's why we have federal judges between surveillance of Americans and the government. It's why we have these people who are appointed, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and ultimately have life appointments. It's that those judges are the ones that are there to protect us. Now, if a lawyer, as happened in the case of Carter Page, lies to the court, then that lawyer is the one who needs to be prosecuted, and he was. Should we have gone further and put him in jail for longer and stripped him of all his licenses? Absolutely. I don't think we did enough there. I think we need to do more. That's why I think some reforms are necessary. But again, it's not about Section 702. And the last thing I'd say for the caller, for Mark in particular, is that President Trump in his administration sought the reauthorization and obtained the reauthorization of this very law because he and his administration understood that this law is not about Americans or the Trump campaign or political operatives or political enemies. It's about foreigners located overseas that are threatening Americans around the globe, both at home and abroad.
Bill is the last call out of Hazelwood, Missouri, Republican. Bill, go ahead. We got about a minute or two left here.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the speaker who's been talking. The only problem I see is he doesn't really mention the fact that that lawyer that was prosecuted was basically let off free. And the reason why that is because the law does not protect us. And anybody that knows anything about government surveillance knows that the United States uses other governments to avoid any responsibility for surveilling Americans. Could you speak on that for a minute?
Sure. So Section 702 actually prohibits the reverse targeting of Americans anywhere in the globe. So you can't use this authority to surveil Americans. We also, when we work with our allies, we don't use them to surveil Americans. That's unlawful. It'd be illegal. If we want to surveil an American anywhere in the world, we go to a court and get a court order. There are people have raised these concerns before. It's a legitimate thing to raise. It's just not something the U.S. government does. When we want to surveil an American, we go to a federal judge, right? Either on the FISA court or in a district court. By the way, the FISA court judges are regular district court judges who just serve temporary appointments on the specialized court.
Jamil Jaffer, always helpful to explain these national security issues. He's with the National Security Institute, the founder of that program at George Mason University's Law School. A good follow on Twitter at Jamil_N_Jaffer is where you can find him. Thanks so much.
Thanks, John.